Before we dive into this epic tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more thrilling sci-fi adventures. The day began like any other, with the sun rising over suburban streets, casting a golden glow on the homes lined with manicured lawns. Emily, an 11-year-old girl, sat at her window, gazing out at the peaceful neighborhood. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and the distant hum of early morning traffic could be heard. She was a typical child, innocent and carefree, with no idea that this ordinary morning would soon spiral into an unimaginable nightmare. Her family lived in a quiet town, far removed from the chaos of the world. Emily's father, a kind man with a gentle smile, had always taught her to value the simple things in life. Her mother, full of love and warmth, had instilled in her a sense of compassion and curiosity about the world around her. Emily often spent her afternoons reading, exploring nature, or just playing in the yard with her dog. Life was good. It was predictable. It was safe. But all that safety would be shattered in an instant. As Emily sat at the window, a strange noise broke through the calm. At first, she thought it was a plane, flying unusually low. But then, the sound intensified, growing louder, deeper, a throbbing hum that shook the windows of her house. Her heart began to race as she stood up, her eyes wide with confusion. Looking up, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a massive craft, unlike anything she had ever seen, descending from the sky. It was sleek, black, and its shape was all wrong, too angular, too menacing for anything human-made. Before Emily could react, the air around her shifted, thickened with an unnatural force. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself was alive with dread. She turned toward the door, but it was too late. A flash of blinding light engulfed her. The very fabric of her reality seemed to warp, and the world she knew was erased in a heartbeat. The aliens had come. When Emily regained consciousness, she found herself in a cold, metallic room. Panic gripped her chest as she tried to move, only to find her limbs bound by unseen forces. She could barely breathe, her throat tight with fear. The air smelled sterile, unfamiliar, nothing like the comforting scent of home. It was silent, save for the low hum of machinery in the background. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she struggled against the restraints, but they were unyielding. "You're awake," a voice echoed from the darkness. The sound was guttural, harsh, and alien. Emily's body went stiff at the sound. The voice didn't sound like any human she had ever heard. It was cold, emotionless, almost mechanical in its tone. She turned her head, but there was nothing in the shadows except the faintest outline of figures. These figures were humanoid, but they had an eerie, unnatural quality, too tall, too thin, their faces obscured by dark helmets or masks. They were unlike anything she had ever seen on Earth. The figure stepped closer, its long, spindly fingers reaching toward her. "You are ours now," it said. "You will serve a purpose." Emily felt a cold wave of dread wash over her as she realized that her worst nightmare had just begun. There was no escape. She was far from home, held captive by beings that seemed to know no compassion. She tried to call out, to scream for help, but the words stuck in her throat. The terror was overwhelming, and she felt small, insignificant, utterly powerless. The aliens didn't seem to care about her fear. They spoke among themselves in a language she couldn't understand, their voices low and unintelligible. Emily tried to focus, to make sense of their words, but all she could comprehend was the cruel tone of their speech. Then, one of them stepped forward, holding what appeared to be a small device. It buzzed with a low hum, and as it approached her, Emily's heart raced. "This will make you obedient," the figure said, its voice devoid of any emotion. "You will not resist." Emily didn't know what the device was, but she instinctively knew it was something horrible. It was a tool of control, something designed to break her spirit. Desperation surged through her. She didn't know how, but she had to fight it. She had to fight them. If she gave in, there would be no escape. She had to hold on to the hope that somehow she could survive this. But the fear was suffocating, like a weight on her chest. She could feel her breath growing shallow as the alien came closer, its long fingers brushing her face. She flinched instinctively, but the touch was cold, clinical, devoid of any warmth. It was as if the alien wasn't even aware of her humanity, of her suffering. She was just a specimen, a tool for their twisted plans. The alien activated the device, and Emily felt a sharp pain in her head. It was as though her thoughts were being ripped away from her, replaced by an overwhelming sense of compliance. She fought against it, pushing back with everything she had, but the pull was strong. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where nothing she did mattered. Her mind screamed for release, but the device held her captive, numbing her will. For what felt like an eternity, Emily was lost in a haze. Her thoughts blurred, her sense of time fractured. The world around her became distant, almost unreal. The fear, the confusion, the helplessness, they all melded into a single, suffocating emotion. She couldn't think clearly, couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming sensation of being controlled, of being reduced to nothing more than a tool for the alien's plans. But even in the darkest moments, a small part of Emily refused to give up. She wouldn't, let herself be defeated. Her family, her home, everything she had known and loved was out there, somewhere. She held on to that thought, clinging to it like a lifeline. She would find a way to survive. She would find a way to escape. As the aliens continued their cruel treatment, Emily's resolve began to strengthen. She realized that they might have her body, but they didn't have her mind, not yet. The device could numb her thoughts, but it couldn't crush her spirit. If she could hold on to that small flame of defiance, there was still hope. The thought of escape, though distant, was the only thing that kept her going. She didn't know how she would do it, or when, but she knew one thing: she couldn't give in. Not yet. Not ever. Emily closed her eyes, the darkness swallowing her whole, but in that darkness, a spark of defiance burned bright. It was a quiet, fragile thing, but it was enough. For now, it was all she had. And it was enough to keep her fighting. Days blurred into one another in that cold, sterile place. Emily was no longer sure how much time had passed. The aliens kept her in a state of constant surveillance, never allowing her a moment of peace. Her limbs were often bound, and she was forced into strange, painful positions that left her exhausted and sore. But worst of all was the constant presence of fear, the fear that she might never escape, that she might never see her family again. Despite everything, Emily had not given up. Every small act of defiance, every fleeting moment when she refused to comply, became a small victory in the silent war she waged within herself. The aliens tried to break her, tried to force her into submission, but her spirit remained unyielding, even in the face of unspeakable horrors. Each time they brought out the device, each time they tried to manipulate her mind, she fought it with every ounce of willpower she could muster. The beings who held her captive were a breed unlike any humans had encountered. They were technologically advanced, their weapons and tools far beyond anything Emily could comprehend. But their biggest weapon wasn't just their technology, it was their complete indifference. To them, she was nothing more than a pawn, an object to be used and discarded. Her pain, her fear, meant nothing. She was merely a tool to serve their needs, to fulfill their purpose. The sense of powerlessness that came with this realization gnawed at her every waking moment, but she refused to let it consume her. Despite the isolation, Emily had started to piece together fragments of the aliens' intentions. She didn't understand all the details, but it became clear that they were not just kidnapping her for random cruelty. They had plans for her, plans that involved something far more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. The way they spoke of the dragon was chilling, a word that filled her with dread every time it echoed in her mind. The more she overheard their conversations, the more she understood that her life, her very existence, was tied to this monstrous creature. She had no idea what it was, but the fear it evoked in the aliens was palpable. It was as if this dragon had a power over them, one that could bring the very fabric of the universe to its knees. They called it a beast, at first, a thing of legend, a creature of unimaginable hunger. But then, the more she heard, the more she realized that it was something far worse. The aliens referred to it as their savior, the being that they had come to Earth to appease. It was as though they were offering her up, a mere child, to feed something far older and far more terrifying than any human could fathom. The thought made Emily's stomach twist in terror. How could a creature like that even exist? And why was she the one chosen to be its meal? The thought of being sacrificed to this beast was unbearable. Emily's heart raced as she tried to come to terms with the nightmare she had been thrust into. She couldn't let it happen. There had to be a way out. But with every passing day, the odds of escape seemed to diminish. The aliens had grown more insistent, more forceful in their attempts to break her. They took every opportunity to remind her of her powerlessness, of the fact that she was their prisoner, their property. But Emily refused to surrender. Even in the darkest hours, when despair seemed to be closing in on her from every side, she held on to the one thing that kept her alive: hope. She wasn't sure how, but she knew she had to survive. She had to make it back home. She had to see her family again. They were out there somewhere, and she couldn't let herself give in to the darkness. The fear of the dragon loomed over her, but it also became a symbol. A symbol of everything she was fighting against. The beast wasn't just an alien creature. It was a metaphor for the overwhelming odds stacked against her, for the endless threats that seemed to close in on her at every turn. But just as the fear of the dragon consumed her thoughts, so did the desire to fight back. She began to notice the small weaknesses in the aliens' control. They may have been advanced, but they were not invincible. Their systems of control, their technology, could be exploited. Every small detail, every shift in their routines, became a clue. Emily realized that if she could just gather enough information, if she could learn enough about their ship, their technology, she might be able to turn the tide. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the days wore on, Emily became more observant. She learned the layout of the ship, memorizing every turn and every haul. She noted the patterns of the guards, the way they moved, the small flaws in their system. There were moments when she was left alone, moments when the aliens grew distracted by their own work, and it was in these moments that Emily had the most freedom. She focused on the details, studying their devices and learning their language as best as she could. It was slow work, but she was patient. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. But the hardest part wasn't just escaping. It was the psychological toll. Every time Emily thought she was close to finding a way out, the aliens would remind her of her helplessness. They would tighten their grip, increase their surveillance, and remind her that she was nothing more than a pawn in their game. But she refused to let them win. No matter how many times they broke her down, she would rise again. She had to. The thought of being consumed by the dragon, of being reduced to nothing but food for some monstrous beast, was too much to bear. In those moments, when despair threatened to engulf her, Emily would think of her family. She would think of her mother's warm embrace, her father's comforting words. She thought of the simple pleasures she had taken for granted, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the taste of her favorite ice cream, the way the sun felt on her skin. These memories became her lifeline, her reason to keep fighting. But it wasn't just for her family that she fought. It was for herself, too. She refused to be a victim. She refused to let the aliens define her fate. They may have taken her from her home, but they hadn't taken her will to survive. Emily wasn't just fighting for escape. She was fighting for her dignity, for her humanity, and for the belief that, no matter how bleak the situation, there was always a way forward. Even in the darkest of places, she believed that if she kept pushing, if she kept fighting, she would find a way out. It was this belief that gave her the strength to endure, the strength to face the unimaginable horrors the aliens had in store for her. The days felt endless, each one a monotonous blur of fear and uncertainty. Emily's mind had become a battleground, constantly shifting between hopelessness and determination. The alien ship, a vast and oppressive structure, was a prison, and she was trapped in its cold, unfeeling grasp. They kept her locked away in a sterile cell, devoid of warmth or humanity, the walls constantly watching, waiting for her to break. But Emily refused. She fought every moment, every thought, every ounce of her being screaming for escape. But as the days dragged on, something began to shift. Emily started to sense that there was something more to the aliens' plans than just their desire to feed her to the dragon. There were subtle changes in their behavior, small things that caught her attention. The way they spoke in hushed tones when they thought she couldn't hear. The way their eyes would dart around nervously when they mentioned the dragon. There was fear there, and that fear told her something important. They were not in control. This was the first crack in the armor. Emily realized that the aliens, despite their advanced technology and ruthless efficiency, were not invincible. They were not all-powerful. In fact, they were terrified of the very thing they had come to Earth to serve. The dragon. This beast, whatever it was, had the aliens in its thrall, and the more Emily pieced together, the more she realized that the aliens themselves were not in control of their fate. They were slaves to this creature, just as much as she had been forced into servitude. The implications of this realization were staggering. It meant that there was a way to fight back. If the aliens were afraid, then maybe she could exploit that fear. But how? How could a single, small human girl stand against a species so powerful, so technologically advanced? How could she possibly outsmart the alien overlords who controlled her every movement? The answer, Emily realized, was simple: she would not fight them on their terms. She would not face them head-on. No, she would have to find a way to turn their fear against them, to make them doubt their own power, to break their hold over her without ever raising a weapon or engaging in direct combat. She would have to play the long game, bide her time, and wait for the right moment. To do this, she needed more information. She needed to understand the aliens' culture, their weaknesses, and most importantly, the nature of the dragon they feared so deeply. Emily knew that in order to survive, she had to learn everything she could about the forces at play in this twisted game. The dragon was key, and if she could find a way to use the creature against the aliens, she might just have a chance. But how could she learn more about it? How could she uncover the true nature of this being that seemed to command such fear? She knew the aliens would not willingly give up this information. They were tight-lipped, secretive, and manipulative. They would not let her have access to the knowledge she needed. It was at this point that Emily had her first breakthrough. In the quiet moments of her captivity, she began to listen more intently to the conversations of the guards, to the murmurings of the alien scientists, and to the whispers that echoed through the ship's corridors. She began to pick up fragments of their language, snippets of sentences that hinted at the truth behind their obsession with the dragon. She learned that the creature was not just a mindless monster. It was something far more dangerous. It was ancient, perhaps older than the aliens themselves. The dragon was a force of nature, a being capable of unimaginable destruction. But it was also a creature of profound intelligence, and it was not easily controlled. The more Emily learned, the more she understood that the dragon was not just a threat to her, but to the aliens as well. It was a force they had long sought to control, but every attempt had failed. Each time they thought they had tamed it, the creature had broken free, causing untold devastation. The dragon was as much a prisoner as Emily was, trapped in a cycle of servitude to these alien beings who sought to harness its power. But there was one key piece of information that Emily uncovered that changed everything. It turned out that the dragon was not the only one capable of destruction. The aliens had made a grave mistake. In their quest to control the beast, they had created something else, something far worse. They had unwittingly unleashed a force that was capable of matching the dragon's power. It was a mistake, a flaw in their designs, and Emily had stumbled upon it by accident. But this mistake, this flaw, was something she could exploit. The revelation hit her like a bolt of lightning. Emily had found the key to her survival. She knew what she had to do. She would have to manipulate the aliens, to make them believe that the very thing they had feared for so long, this force they had created, was now beyond their control. She would use their own fears against them, turning their obsession with the dragon into their undoing. It was a dangerous game, one that could backfire at any moment. But Emily had no choice. She had already seen how the aliens operated, how they controlled everything, and how they were not above using anyone and anything as a means to an end. Now it was her turn to turn the tables. She had learned enough about their technology, their fears, and their weaknesses to make a plan. But the hardest part was still ahead. She had to convince the aliens that their worst nightmare was real, that the dragon had been awakened and that nothing they could do would stop it. As she plotted, Emily could feel a sense of power beginning to build within her. It was a small thing, but it was enough to keep her going. She knew the odds were stacked against her, that the aliens would not give up easily. But for the first time since her capture, she had hope. The fear that had once consumed her was now a distant memory, replaced by the cold determination of a girl who was willing to fight for her life at any cost. The clock was ticking, and every second that passed brought her closer to her goal. She had to act quickly, before the aliens realized what she was up to. She knew that the stakes were higher than ever before, but she was ready. No longer would she be the helpless captive. Now, Emily was the one in control. And she would do whatever it took to turn the tables on her captors and find her way back home. The plan was simple in theory, but execution would be anything but. Emily had learned enough to understand the delicate balance of fear and power that held the alien forces in place. The dragon was the key, but it wasn't just about manipulating their perception of the creature. It was about weaving a story so convincing, so terrifying, that it would unhinge the very foundation of their control. Every day, Emily observed, listened, and plotted. She kept track of their routines, their habits, the moments when they let their guard down. She began to notice patterns in the way they communicated, subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in their behavior that indicated growing unease. It wasn't just the dragon that scared them, it was the very possibility that their empire, their control, might collapse under the weight of a force they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The more she learned, the more she realized just how fragile their empire truly was. They had reached the pinnacle of technological achievement, yes, but their power was built on a foundation of fear, fear of the unknown, fear of the dragon, and fear of the very forces they had unleashed upon themselves. Emily understood now that their fear wasn't just about survival. The hours spent in the alien vessel became a test of Emily's patience and resolve. The plan had to be more than just a theoretical strategy. It had to work in the real world, where every misstep could cost her not just her life but potentially derail her entire mission. She had spent days refining the details, building on the fragments of information she had gathered, and weaving together a narrative that she hoped would be powerful enough to fracture the very foundation of the aliens' control. But she knew one thing for certain: once she set her plan into motion, there would be no turning back. The first step was to create the illusion. It had to feel real, convincing enough to rattle even the most hardened of the alien captors. She would use the knowledge she had gained about their culture, their history with the dragon, and their deep-rooted fear of the unknown to craft an idea so horrifying that it would seem like the manifestation of their worst nightmares. She would show them, through subtle hints and careful manipulation, that they had failed in their quest to control the dragon. That it wasn't the dragon they should fear anymore, but the force they had inadvertently unleashed, the creation they had worked so tirelessly to tame. Emily knew that this force, whatever it was, had to remain a mystery to them. If they knew too much about it, if they understood its true nature, then it would lose its power. Fear, after all, thrived on the unknown, on the parts of reality that were never fully explained. And so, the details had to remain shrouded in darkness. What Emily had learned about this unknown force had to be enough to sow panic, but not enough to give the aliens the comfort of understanding. If they understood it, they might find a way to control it, so she had to make sure they never could. But Emily also knew she couldn't go this route alone. She would need allies, and the only way to get them was to use the alien captors' fear against them. She knew there were divisions within their ranks, alien factions that were not entirely unified in their approach. While some saw the dragon as a necessary tool, others saw it as a threat, an uncontrollable force that could spell their downfall. Those divisions were key. By playing on those fears, Emily could manipulate the factions against one another, turning the aliens' hierarchy into a source of internal chaos. The more she thought about it, the more Emily realized that her plan was like a game of chess. Every move had to be calculated, every piece in place before she made her move. She couldn't afford to rush. The moment she made the wrong move, the illusion would crumble, and she would be left with nothing. The stakes were too high to act impulsively. Her first step was to plant seeds of doubt. She would begin by subtly altering her interactions with her captors. Emily had always been silent, frightened, and compliant, but that would change. She needed to begin speaking to them, showing that she understood more than they realized. She would speak in fragments of their own language, dropping hints that she had knowledge of things they couldn't fathom. She would speak about the dragon, but in a way that suggested she knew it wasn't just a beast, it was a force. A force that could be turned against them, one that was now outside their control. As she spoke, Emily knew she had to keep her tone calm, almost casual, as though she were simply recounting facts. Panic was contagious, and she didn't want to give them any reason to believe she was desperate. Fear had to come from within them, not from her. She had to create an environment where their own anxieties would spread, infecting everyone who heard her words. And so, over the next few days, Emily carefully built the foundation of her illusion. She spoke about the dragon's history, the mistakes the aliens had made in their attempts to control it. She whispered that the dragon was no longer the beast they thought they had tamed, that it was now something worse. Something far beyond their understanding. She didn't need to provide proof. The mere suggestion would be enough. Slowly, the cracks began to show. The guards grew nervous, their conversations more hurried, their eyes darting around the ship as though they were expecting something to leap out from the shadows. Emily could feel the shift. It was subtle at first, but it was there. They were listening. They were starting to question. But Emily knew that she couldn't stop there. She had to escalate. If she had learned anything in the last few weeks, it was that the alien captors had long been operating under a false sense of control. They believed they were masters of the situation. But what they didn't realize was that they were walking on a knife's edge. The truth was, their control was always an illusion. They were as much prisoners of their empire as the species they enslaved. Emily had just found the key to shattering that illusion. The dragon had been their weapon, but now it had become their vulnerability. With each passing day, the tension inside the ship grew thicker. Emily could see it in the way the aliens communicated, the way they carried themselves. There was a new urgency, a growing fear. And that fear was the perfect weapon. She had given them just enough doubt to make them question their power, but now it was time for the final piece of the puzzle. It was time for them to believe that the threat they had been trying to control was no longer a threat, it was a certainty. Emily's plan was coming to fruition. The walls of their carefully constructed empire were beginning to crack, and all it would take now was one final push to bring it all crashing down. She knew that in the end, it would be their fear that would defeat them, not her. They were afraid of what they had created, and in that fear, they would destroy themselves. And when that happened, Emily would be ready. She would be free.